Good morning and good evening, everybody. Uh, Good evening to those who are connecting to us abroad from the US. My name is Shirinkoy Karimov, and I'm the coordinator of American Space Almaty. Welcome to our program, which is called Friday Talks with Stephen Friedman. We are very, very happy to announce that today we have very special guests. So let me introduce regional public engagement specialist, Tracy Gable.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another edition of Friday Talk with Stephen Friedman. As Shirin said, my name is Tracy Gable, and I am the Regional Public Engagement Specialist in Almaty, Kazakhstan. And I have the fortunate job of getting to work with American spaces across Central Asia. Today is a very special event and may be a little surprise to our featured speaker, Stephen. But it's been almost or exactly 2 years since Stephen did his first discussion club at American Space Almaty in 2018, and he did that on World Health Day. So in addition to being able to join this session because of the wonderful 2 years that we've spent working with Stephen, I would also like to introduce a couple of other very special guests. The first is the U.S. Consul General in Almaty, Eric Meyer, and the Public Affairs Officer in Almaty, Kazakhstan as well. Eric?
Great, thanks, Tracy, and it's great to be here this morning. And Steve, congratulations on the 2-year anniversary. That was a surprise to me as well. I've known Stephen a long time, and he really enjoyed his time here in Kazakhstan. As you know, he was due to come back here in the spring to speak around the country, and due to COVID was not able to do that. So I want to thank Tracy and the American Spaces team and Stephen for organizing these Friday morning talks. Stephen has touched on some really interesting topics the last few weeks. Today, we're going to talk, it's Space Week, so he's going to touch on that. As you know, and many of you have read, he was acclaimed by the New York Times as a genius philosopher, and we're very fortunate to have him here today. So Steve, thank you again, and welcome to everyone. And I'd like to ask Anand just to say a couple of quick words. As Tracy mentioned, he is our new public affairs officer and a fellow Southern Californian. Anand.
Well, hello everyone, and it's nice to meet you all. As Eric said, I just arrived in Almaty a couple of months ago, and one of the first things I heard is you need to hear Stephen Friedman talk. You must come to one of these. So I am excited to hear more about what he has to say, and otherwise I look forward to being a regular part of the American Spaces community. Thank you very much.
Okay, is it?
So with that, let's turn it over to Stephen.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, everyone at the American Consulate in Almaty. I appreciate this opportunity. I didn't realize it was quite a 2-year anniversary, but I am thrilled to have had this opportunity and to have it be an ongoing experience. These talks began, the current set of talks began about 6 weeks ago, and each one is designed to be independent, but at the same time to make reference to draw upon ideas that I might have developed previously. So attending consecutive talks is a way of enriching your understanding of ideas that are not necessarily in broad circulation, where we're mostly focused upon philosophical ideas, and philosophy is not something that is broadly or deeply understood. I've had experiences even with eminent faculty in philosophy who when I ask them, how would you characterize philosophy as an enterprise, as an activity, can't really distill it. I find that the distillation of everything is the key to clarity and a useful understanding, an understanding that can be applied in varieties of directions. I've emphasized that philosophy is simply the limit of rigor. So whatever is incontestable, belongs to philosophy. Everything else, whether it's opinion, theory, belief, faith, is a different category, a category that, for me, I give the general term heuristic. So the philosophical is rigorous, is incontestable. Examples of such propositions are: the past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past. The world is different in different directions. We cannot leave the world to view the world. Those types of distillations that actually ramify throughout our understanding of experience and in fact give in a distilled form the logic that underlies what the religions, the great religions, have aspired to at their deepest or highest. So concepts like mystical union with God or Buddhist enlightenment can actually be explicated through philosophical ideas relating to the nature of rigor at its limit. Now, this is something that is actually the result of an evolution of thought. The intuitions of the great religions are strong and deep, but they were elaborated in general 1,500, 2,000, 2,500 years ago. There's been intellectual progress since, and that intellectual progress has allowed us to achieve clarity and understanding of what might previously have been expressed metaphorically, but now can be expressed in terms of, again, a limiting rigor that has the power of the religions at their, again, highest or deepest aspiration. Today's topic is space week. I wanted to begin by talking a little bit about process. At the end of last week's talk, someone asked a question about existentialism. Existentialism will come up repeatedly, not as a branch of philosophy, but as an attempt to come to terms with the circumstance we can't leave the world to view it from the outside. Something that I find not even existentialists have quite clearly articulated. But one of the first philosophers I ever read was a French existentialist, Gabriel Marcel. And he wrote a book. It was actually, I think, from a set of lectures he gave. It's been a long time since I've read it. I haven't looked at it in many years. But he began by focusing on the actual process of articulating and delivering and formulating a philosophical talk. Well, that type of process can, I think, help in understanding some of the aspects of philosophy that might otherwise be elusive. Well, so normally I will get the topic for the week's talk at the beginning of the week, Monday or Tuesday. And typically, when I first see the topic, nothing might enter my mind, okay? I tend not to, it's sort of my method of working. I tend not to pursue ideas. I tend to, at this stage, allow them to come to me. Freud represents an example of someone who went in search of ideas. So the process was often contrived, not organic. As a result, Freud is no longer taught in medical schools. When I was when I was at UCLA Medical School some years ago, Freud's name never once came up. His work was not allowed to incubate sufficiently. He again ran in search of results. He also his work didn't quite survive Wittgenstein, the great 20th century philosopher's sort of attack on him, nor did it really effectively survive controlled experimentation, which attempted to see if his methodologies did in fact achieve psychological improvements in people suffering from various types of mental issues. But in any case, there's what I call an ad hoc aspect to what Freud did. He wanted a solution and he forged one. I like to allow things to come to me and to develop. Well, the first idea that came to me in response to this week's topic was an aphorism. And I, again, people that have joined previously know that I write primarily in aphoristic form, highly concentrated philosophical statements. Examples are of what I gave before. The past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past. Those are highly concentrated summaries, distillations of, in many cases, lots of argumentation, lots of developed ideas that coalesce into a final decisive formulation, the kind of formulation that for me is adequate to a moment of crisis, a moment of death, when one needs something strong enough and concentrated enough so that it's readily at hand. It's, at such a moment of crisis, one can't go off and read a novel, right? That's too expansive. One needs something concentrated and definitive. So, that's the character of my writing in general. I've written maybe about 20,000 aphorisms at this point, and they're designed to approach a basic core of understanding from lots of different directions. And I find that different individuals respond to different aphorisms with a kind of almost instantaneous, sense of illumination. I've given some examples before. An example that I talked about a few weeks back was we suffer because we think the past is fixed and controls the future. But the reality is the opposite, that the past is not fixed and the future decides it. That particular aphorism has had a transformative effect upon some individuals, that I've shared it with. I never know in advance what aphorism might produce understanding, but in general, I find that it's one of the most effective means of communicating the core, of the philosophical results. The aphorism that came to mind first, when the topic again presented itself, was the stars in metaphor or science are possibilities of other worlds. Okay? It's actually a relatively early aphorism. The key word in that aphorism is possibilities. If we're dealing with possibilities, we're not dealing with rigor. We're not dealing with something that is philosophy per se. We're dealing with something that is, again, the general term I use, heuristic. A heuristic space is a space of possibility. That famous philosophical question, if there's no one in a forest and a tree falls, does it make a sound? Well, the way that situation is set up, if there's no one to experience the event, we can say anything or nothing. And what we in fact say decides, reveals what a fact is to us. But because there's no direct experience of it, that situation occupies, again, what I characterize, what I call heuristic space. We can say whatever we like. We can say that what happens is roughly what would happen if somebody were present, or we can imagine an infinite set of possibilities. Okay? What the types of possibilities that we entertain, where we don't have absolute certainty, absolute rigor, are possibilities that are helpful to us in some way, useful in some way, maybe entertaining in some way, maybe inspiring, but not rigorous. Now you might say, well, entertaining, inspiring, that sounds desirable. Well, yes, it has its place, but the heuristic helps us. It can help us survive in this world. It achieves specific ends for us. It achieves goals, but it doesn't have the power to save us in the sense in which religions talk about salvation, a complete solution right here, right now, independent of all possible future experience. Only the limit of rigor achieves that. And again, that's something I've discussed in previous talks, and I'll go back to because that's part of the most important aspect of the meaning, the implication of philosophy. But so the stars represent possibilities. One of the things that's true of anything that's not rigorous is that means any goal that we aspire to. That means any set of imaginings about what might be possible, in terms of travel to a distant world. The main logic of a rigorous space of philosophy is difference. Rigor is of difference. Turns out that it is our difference from everything else that is the basis for our existing at all. Our difference from everything else is the basis of our fundamental dignity. Our difference from everything else is the basis for the circumstance that whatever has applied to anything else, including disease, old age, and death, need not rigorously apply to us. So it's actually a means of that application of an exacting rigor, an exacting analysis of difference is able to achieve what Buddhism sought, namely an elimination of concepts like disease, old age, and death. The Buddha famously sought not to find an accommodation to disease, old age, and death, but to end them. And to end them then and there in 550 BC. Well, the Buddha thought, Siddhartha Gautama thought he had achieved that. And it's something that I'd like to talk about at some later date, how he thought he had achieved that. Well, just in general, the two ways one can achieve such a result is either to enter a laboratory and cure everything, which he was not in a position to do, nor are we, or end the concepts. And ending concepts turns out to be an extremely difficult, demanding exercise, and there are only a few avenues that achieve it successfully. One turns out to be a limit of divergence, one turns out to be a limit of convergence. I say those things now, not to fully explain them, and that's something to keep in mind. Don't think everything I say needs to be fully transparent. Some of the things I'm saying, I'm saying just so you hear them. And I find that kind of exposure can be helpful on a second and a third encounter. Okay, so don't put undue pressure on yourself. Don't think that everything is transparent or has to be transparent. I'm saying certain things just for the exposure to them, at this point. Okay, to give you a sense of the form of a solution without necessarily elaborating all the details of it, okay? But keep in mind, those details do exist and are achievable, and everything, even some of the deeper, results are accessible, and they can be made accessible. And that's the point of having 20,000 aphorisms, 20,000 routes of approach, so that there will be some way, of making making all of these results understandable to any given individual. Okay, but one aspect that I wanted to sort of present about heuristic space, about things that involve the achievement of goals, objects of different kinds, is that they represent convergences. Like, to achieve a goal, one has to make perhaps repeated efforts. Each instance, each effort, each application is what I call a convergent element. Okay? An object, even the object of our normal experience, like a table, a chair, represents a set of convergent elements of past experience with that object or similar objects, present sensation, what we're experiencing directly from the object, and future expectation, also based upon a broad sense of what that object is in the context of our cumulative experiences. Those cumulative experiences represent convergences. I think I mentioned a couple of times now that meaning, when we talk about like the meaning of a poem, the meaning of the world, what we're talking about is what all the elements of that poem, or all the elements of a life, or all the elements of a world converge on. That resulting formulation or expression represents the meaning of whatever it is we're addressing. So this concept of convergence is something that actually represents the governing logic of heuristic space, which is everything that's not rigorous, which means until we've explored more about the nature of philosophic space itself, which is strange because it's limit of rigor and we're not typically thinking or living, at that limit. Well, it'll take a little while to get comfortable with that idea, but the point is that goals, objects, are convergences, the result of elements put together. And the governing logic of this heuristic, convergent, non-rigorous space that in general we see around us and that we're living in is some order of convergence will, in principle, achieve any given result. So that means that whatever the goal might be, and it could be a personal goal, it could be the goal of some type of interplanetary travel, it could be the goal of making Mars a terrestrial environment. Whatever the goal is achievable in principle by some accumulation of elements. Okay, and if you say, well, how do you know that for sure? Well, the answer is we're not dealing in philosophic rigorous space. In heuristic space, there's nothing that can be known for sure because each circumstance is different. And any difference is enough to make the application of one thing to another not rigorous. Okay, but it's the justification ultimately for those types of encouragements. The Churchill admonition, never surrender, or the Silicon Valley guideline. Just when you're at the point of giving up is when you're almost there. Keep adding additional elements. And it's the nature of that space that you can't know in advance whether something is definitively achievable, but the logic of the space encourages you to continue to make the effort, to continue to make the application. Okay. Now, so stars in metaphor science are possibilities of other worlds. That's the first thought that came to my mind. The second thought that came to my mind was a line from a T.S. Eliot poem, Four Quartets. T.S. Eliot was a late 19th century, early 20th century American by birth, writer, poet, literary critic. He was an expatriate. He eventually moved to England, took up residence and spent most of his mature career in England. But he was an undergraduate at Harvard, actually, and studied philosophy there. studied philosophy in the late 19th century, at Harvard, when the department had not yet achieved the level of rigor that philosophy now exemplifies. But a lot of his poetic works are infused with a sense of philosophy and a sense of philosophical yearning. The line that came to mind after that aphorism was a line from a work, The Four Quartets, a work that is probably his most philosophically inspired. It is actually modeled at, the name Four Quartets is modeled after musical compositions, quartets. He was especially drawn to the quartets, the string quartets of Beethoven, which were in fact among my favorite works when I was in college. So it has a musical character. But the line that came to mind was, and I think I just want to make sure, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Well, obviously, we're coming back to a place that might be different, right? Every moment is different. If we pay sufficient attention, if we are on a quantum mechanical scale, looking very closely at experience, everything is different, moment to moment. But there will be differences in the initial, in the re-encounter, but the most significant difference is ourselves, right? We will have changed. The exploration, the lifetime journey that T.S. Eliot was describing, because the poem was written towards the end of his life, is something that will have transformed us. This relates to that existential awareness that we can't leave the world to view it, that we are always seeing it through our own eyes. When people say you can't judge or you shouldn't judge, well, there's religious admonition, do not judge, right? Because it's a divine injunction. But from a philosophical standpoint, you cannot legitimately judge because you cannot sufficiently know the circumstances of another, right? You can't, it's not enough to walk in their shoes. It's not enough to occupy their skin. You have to have been born in their skin and not to be in your own, okay? So you can't leave yourself. Even, there's a film, Being John Malkovich, that came out a while, maybe 20 years ago now. The writer, Charlie Kaufman, has a philosophical bent. I don't really know a lot about his biography, but the film is infused at least with the lessons and preoccupations of one or two philosophy courses that one would encounter, let's say, as an undergraduate. In that film, the idea, the conceit, the idea of the film is that there's a portal into John Malkovich, the actor's mind, and it's like a ride. You can enter through this portal into John Malkovich and see the world through his eyes. But of course, you're not becoming John Malkovich. You are a tourist viewing the world through his eyes, but still you retain your own identity, or ultimately that's your point of reference. So we cannot leave ourselves even when we go into the far reaches of space. That will be the most important determinant of our experience, that we will not fundamentally be changed even as we venture to distant galaxies. When I was, a little bit of personal background, my father was American, born in New York. Actually, it's exciting. He made me a New York Yankees baseball fan, and the Yankees today won an important playoff game. So that's exciting to me. But my mother was English, born in London. My parents met during World War II. And she had a large family that I visited for the first time when I was 12. It was exciting. It was the first time I'd ever ventured out of the country, the first time I'd ever gone to Europe. And I looked forward to it as much as any experience. I went to Europe a number of times over the years because I had so much family to visit. I could, stay with family. The second time I went, a few years later, was after I'd begun to study philosophy. In fact, that initial trip when I was 12 happened just before I encountered my first work of philosophy. I was reading a lot of science and math when I was young. And I went into a bookstore one day and I found a book that I thought was science. The title was Science in the Modern World. Thought this might be interesting. It was written by an Alfred North Whitehead, turns out to have been a professor of, philosophy actually, but he was also a mathematician and educator, initially at Cambridge and then at Harvard. Well, Science in the Modern World turned out not to be a book about science, but a book about philosophy, and a difficult book about philosophy. So, and I started reading that right after I came back from that first visit to Europe. A few years later, I'd read a lot of philosophy. I kind of was reading systematically through initially the Western philosophical tradition, starting with Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas and Descartes, people like that. And around the time I was set to go to England for the second time, I happened to be reading Kant. And at that point, I wasn't so interested in what I might see in the European landscape. I was interested in the nature of the color blue. And that was something that I could experience here in Los Angeles, as well as, roaming, across continents. So once I became philosophically attuned, what mattered to me wasn't the changing circumstances, but the nature of our present circumstances, simply because a complete solution to the world, the kind of solution that rigor, aspires to, that philosophy aspires to, has to pertain here and now at every possible point, independent of all possible future experience, even future travel experience. It's the nature of the solution. And again, as we go into the nature of rigor, we'll see exactly how that solution is achieved. But the result was, I was not enthusiastic any longer. It seemed superfluous. What mattered was the nature of present experience, not, what might present itself, which again was going to be seen through my eyes, and so would be fundamentally the same, anyway. Kant, it turns out, I think shared a similar view. He spent all of his life within 40 miles of his place of birth, never traveled. And yet Kant is one of the candidates for greatest of all philosophers. I mean, if you're interested in kind of a short list, that short list, at least in terms of Western philosophers, is often given as Aristotle, Kant, and now Wittgenstein. And I happen also to have a strong predilection to Kierkegaard. So for me, those four represent an acme, of philosophical achievement and insight. Well, similar thing is true of Newton. Newton never left England. So it's not necessary to travel far in order to see far, to see deeply. And that brings us to a fundamental consideration about space, about, call it outer space, right? What's beyond our Earth, beyond our atmosphere. The decisive moment in the modern understanding of space, outer space, was the Newton experience with the apple. Apparently, and when I was in college, I had a course with I. Bernard Cohen, who was considered, at least for a time, the world's leading authority on the work of Newton. And apparently there was such an encounter that Newton had, but what's important is what it meant. There's a famous line by Paul Valéry, the French poet, who said, "It's obvious to everyone that the moon is not falling. Obvious to everyone except Newton." That was the decisive insight that changed our whole understanding of space, that opened up the modern physics, the modern sense of the cosmos that we currently have. Prior to the work of Newton, and largely inspired by Aristotle, there was seen as a fundamental distinction between this earth and what was beyond it in the heavens. This earth was seen as a realm of change. It was seen as made up of four elements that were in turbulent sort of motion: air, water, fire, earth. Right? And somehow they got disturbed, at the beginning of some development, some evolutionary development, and the whole effort, subsequently was for those elements to reestablish, some equilibrium. So, air and fire were ascending, were rising, and water and earth were falling, but there was so much turbulence that they couldn't ever quite achieve, a final equilibrium. But the most important upshot of that view was, and what it was attempting to explain, was the fact that this world on earth was a world of change, constant change. It was in motion, and it was in kind of a radical type of motion, a radical type of change. In contrast, the heavens were seen as made of like two realms. First, it was the realm of the planets, and the planets were moving, and they were changing in varieties of ways. But then beyond that were the stars. And the stars seemed to be unchanging. And the view from the time of Aristotle up until really the time of Newton, or 17th century, was that the earth and the heavens were made of fundamentally different substances. They were not the same at all. The earth, again, was made up of things that conduced to change. The heavens were eternal. The stars remained fixed in position. I mean, they might be revolving or rotating around the earth, but their relative positions did not change. And so the heavens became an image of divinity, an image of eternity, the face of God, if you like. The key issue there is whether or not the heavens and the earth are fundamentally the same or fundamentally different. For most of the 2,000 years after Aristotle, they were seen as fundamentally different. But then Newton watches an apple fall, looks at the moon, and says to himself, gravity extends to the apple, causes that to fall. And by the way, Newton didn't know what gravity was. In a sense, we don't know what gravity is. We have laws that can account for how things behave or move, under the influence of gravity within gravitational fields. And that was Newton's interest. And that was part of the revolutionary approach of modern science and Newtonian physics, not to try to explain, but to account for and to describe, okay? So Newton kind of speculated that gravity that was responsible for the fall of an apple could perhaps be seen as being responsible for the fall of the moon. That the moon would be also under the influence of the Earth's gravitational pull. And then the question becomes, well, if the moon is falling in the way that an apple is falling, why isn't it falling into the Earth? And that becomes the basis for, well, Newtonian physics, that it's not falling into the Earth because it's falling around the Earth. And we won't go into like the physics of that now, but the point is that the key insight isn't so much an insight, it's we might call it a heuristic step. Heuristics establish similarities. Look for similarities. It's those similarities that help us. We, for example, learn the laws of science, the laws of physics emphasize similarities. If an oven, for example, is hot, it can burn us, right? We then learn that hot ovens burn, that helps us avoid them. That becomes an instrument of survival. Anything similar to that oven over there, that looks like it, that glows like it, is something to be avoided. That helps us survive. Well, the idea of extending gravity from the realm, of the Earth to the heavens meant that now things out there, the moon, the planets, could be seen as fundamentally the same, operating under fundamentally the same laws. Well, we're familiar with circumstances on Earth and the behavior of things on Earth. We have then an apparatus, a lot of like laws and principles that we can perhaps apply to things beyond the Earth that we're not necessarily going to be in direct contact with. We may never be in direct contact. I mean, now we're sending, satellites, to explore the sun, to explore the distant solar system. We may or may not ever, explore distant galaxies. But our understanding of those galaxies is based upon the idea that they are fundamentally the same as what we experience here. It's actually a similar methodological device to how we understand now the past. At one time, it was seen that the past didn't extend very far back, that under the influence of biblical writings, it was felt that the world had begun, and there was a bishop Usher, who did the calculation based on the Bible, that the world had begun 4004 BC. Well, in the 19th century, people began to think in terms of this principle of what's called uniformitarianism. The idea that maybe the processes in the past are similar to the processes taking place now. And so processes of mountain formation, or earthquakes and volcanoes and the like that we can observe also were happening in the past. Well, we can see changes in landscapes, but they take place very slowly. Well, what people applying this principle to the history of the Earth came to the conclusion was the Earth had to have existed much longer than 4,000 years into the past, or 6,000 years into the past. Millions and ultimately billions of years would be needed if those processes that we see around us, those volcanic processes, could be used to explain everything that had happened in the past as well. So it's a matter of, again, making a judgment that certain things are similar, not fundamentally different. And so what applies here and now applies there and then. And it becomes, again, not something that we can ever be certain of, right? We're not going to go back in time and observe, these processes. We're, again, probably not possibly ever going to be able to reach through actual human travel distant reaches of the universe. But our understanding is based upon thinking in terms of similarity, not difference. From difference, we can't draw conclusions. From similarities, we can. So science is heuristic in that the way that it amplifies and exploits similarities. Rigor goes in the opposite direction, difference. Well, okay, so Newton is looking up at the apple, and the apple leads to the moon, and that leads to a fundamentally different understanding of what's taking place beyond our Earth. That the processes taking place on planets, the processes taking place on stars can be understood in terms of processes that in principle we have access to here. The elements found in the sun, the elements found in the stars are comparable elements to what we have here. So the chemistry of the stars becomes understandable in terms of the chemistry of what's accessible to us here. Yes, and it's powerful. It's not rigorous, but it's powerful. It's a mythology, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's mythology in that it's not rigorously validatable, but it's mythology in that it is powerful. And mythologies have always been powerful. The Egyptian mythology guided the construction of the pyramids. And the pyramids remained the tallest, most imposing structures created by humankind until the Eiffel Tower. So for 5,000 years. So mythologies have always been powerful. Mythologies are not things that are wrong or useless. They are things that are useful. They're just not rigorously validatable for one reason or another. Okay, so again, so now we're looking up at the heavens, and we're seeing it similar to ourselves, or similar to our experience on Earth. One of the things that immediately brings to my mind is something that's a little bit in a different direction, but I think it kind of merits a little discussing. Our fears, our phobias, especially in terms of dealing with unfamiliar kinds of environments. One of the most common human phobias is acrophobia, right? And that comes into play here. It especially comes into play when we talk about, in my instance, looking up. Because I have experienced acrophobia, where I'll get queasy, I'll feel like almost dizzy, but not typically from looking down. When I look down at something, I see Earth, and that's secure. I'll experience that sense of kind of disorientation, that kind of phobic reaction when I look up and I see nothing. Okay? That is disorienting for me. It's interesting to speculate and to try to understand what the source of that acrophobia is that tends to make us a little bit more earthbound. And one of the interesting things about it, acrophobia is related actually closer to other kinds of phobias, like agoraphobia, fear of open spaces. They're connected, psychologically. One of the interesting circumstances about the space program, I used to have a neighbor who worked for NASA. She was originally from Huntsville, Alabama, where NASA's, I think, main headquarters are. But NASA was assembling the engines for the space shuttle in Los Angeles. And so she, at one point, transferred from Huntsville to Los Angeles, and she lived next door to me. In fact, one time she took me over to the facility where the shuttle engines, were being built. And one of the things she told me, and I think I can say this because I think we've gone beyond it, but she said one of the things that was never really discussed early in the space program was that anytime an astronaut, and this probably applies to the Apollo program, for example, Gemini maybe, Gemini certainly. Anytime an astronaut did a spacewalk, an extravehicular activity, left the safety of the spacecraft and was tethered, but went outside to do some type of activity, some repair, some adjustment, maybe just, for the experience to see, if it was tolerable, it turned out not to be. Every initial spacewalk led to a panic attack on the part of the astronauts. And it was a major concern early on. Would we ever be able to adapt in such a way that astronauts could go outside of spacecrafts in, the void of space and maintain their mental integrity, not like suffer this visceral, primal, reaction to the emptiness of it. I mean, again, I think now astronauts are trained and are trained sufficiently so that, yes, they're able to achieve that. But it was a challenge early on. Well, where does this acrophobia, and now I want to focus specifically on acrophobia. We can understand acrophobia in terms of our evolutionary heritage and in terms of our evolutionary descent. And when I kind of was putting together this talk, it was interesting that the topic is space, right? But acrophobia kind of enters the picture in terms of our ability to function, in these kinds of environments, unfamiliar environments, elevated environments. The film that perhaps most convincingly, captured the experience of space was Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. It came out, I think, in 1968, thereabouts, and was revolutionary in cinematic technique. People were astonished, when they first saw that film. What's interesting about that film is it's partly a meditation on human intelligence, tool making, and evolutionary advance. But it begins at the dawn of humankind, in primal circumstances. Well, so here we are talking about space, and I want to go back quickly to those primal circumstances, not as represented in 2001, but based on what we now know or understand about our evolutionary ancestry. And by the way, when I talk about evolutionary ancestry, again, I'm referring to theory of evolution, ultimately Darwin's theory of evolution. And we've talked about that a couple of times. What I want to emphasize again is that if you have any doubt about that theory, now it's a theory, so it's not a certainty, it's a theory, but any doubt about it, just read On the Origin of Species, Darwin's work, introducing that theory to the world. Darwin knew the kind of reception it would get. He knew there would be hostility. He knew that there would be reluctance to embrace these ideas. The evidence he provided for that theory in that book is overwhelming. Just read the first 100 pages and you will no longer have any doubt. It's that there's that much order of convergence, all things coming together, evidence marshaled for this result that will lead you to conclude that even if you're a theist, even if you believe in God, even if you believe in divine sort of control over processes, well, that God in his or her wisdom decided that life would move forward, would advance through the theory of evolution. It's that compelling, okay? And it's powerful in terms of its applications. It's already led to some Nobel Prizes for work on cancer. It's that important. It's as compelling a theory as humanity has achieved. But so according to our present understanding, human beings descended from trees, life in trees, right? That about 3 million years ago, 4 million years ago, 5 million years ago, our ancestors were arboreal. lived in trees. They weren't chimpanzees. They were some other form related to chimpanzees, primates, and there's a lot of evidence of that. The most obvious evidence is these, our hands. You know, people are often taught, I was taught, that this ability for us to grasp the opposable thumb, right, that could grasp our fingers and so manipulate tools was the key to human evolution. No. Primates in general can do that. These hands are designed for grasping branches, okay? That's what this means. The evolutionary advance was in our feet. Our toes used to be, our big toes used to also be opposable for grasping branches. When we became terrestrial, when we moved from life in trees to life on the ground, and walking became central and essential, you know, to our movement, and walking became an efficient mode, you know, of locomotion for us, of movement for us. Well, we lost the opposable big toe, and the toe is now aligned. That's for efficiency of walking. That's the evolutionary advance that made us human, with some others. But that was central and decisive. Not the opposable thumb, the non-opposable big toe. Well, at some point, as that was happening evolutionarily, about 3 million years ago, we were no longer quite as adapted to life in trees, right? Suddenly, life in trees became precarious, but that was our evolutionary ancestry. That was what we were adapted to primarily up till that point. When evolution changes direction, takes us, in our case, us from trees to the ground, but we still have that inclination, that comfort being in trees that we are no longer adapted to, well, suddenly that impulse to stay in trees, to return to trees, becomes a threat to our survival. That famous fossil form, fossil ancestor of ours, Lucy, from about 3 million years ago, died of a broken femur. Femurs are the largest bone in our body. They tend to break in falls, significant falls. It is likely that Lucy died from a fall from a tree. Well, at some point, as we are evolving from trees to land, we are no longer able to live in trees as well, and we need something to keep us out of trees. At that point, when we undergo an evolutionary change, we need something to keep us from going back. That is the value, at least of the phobia of acrophobia. Squirrels, chimpanzees, other primates, mammals that live in trees do not have a fear of heights. We do. And that fear was adaptive, served us when we no longer were adapted to life in trees and needed something to keep us out. That is the ultimate source of acrophobia. Okay, so it's something that we have to contend with, right, as we explore, again, environments that are not familiar to us or that are not ultimately suited to us. We're adapted to a very narrow set of circumstances, to temperatures between about 20 and 40 degrees Celsius, to sea level atmospheric pressure, to sea level oxygen concentrations in the air, to 0.9% NaCl solutions, relatively to roughly neutral pH. Any significant deviation from that, and suddenly our life is threatened. So it's not unusual, for there to be fears that keep us where we are most adapted, or keep us from going back to what we are no longer adapted to. Now, I should say, one of the things about acrophobia, it was my strongest phobia. And one day I was in the San Fernando Valley on a street corner where there were tall office buildings, like 25-story office buildings. And I was looking up at the tops of those buildings and experiencing my acrophobia. And I was feeling queasy and the like. Well, I just started writing philosophy. At the time, I was only seeing philosophy as a rigor, as something that was interested in elaborating incontestable propositions that didn't necessarily have any connection to normal human psychology, for example, that couldn't necessarily help us in any way, except that rigor might in some way be helpful. But it wasn't clear yet what that connection might be. Well, I was standing, looking up at these buildings, feeling my queasiness, my dizziness, and for some reason, I decided to run through my mind an aphorism that I just written. Selflessness, how one acts not out of need. And the point of that aphorism is that rigorously, we can't know that we have specific needs. Needs are heuristic. We can think based on past experience that we need certain things, but rigorously, since any experience or any set of circumstances is different in some way than any previous set of circumstances, what we think we need is, again, it's a heuristic, it's not a certainty. Okay? So it turns out that running that thought through my mind had a magical effect. I said it to myself, and all of a sudden, the acrophobia vanished. It was gone. I was fine. I was looking up, no more queasiness, no more, sense of disorientation. Turns out that a lot of our anxieties, fears, are based upon things that we presume about our circumstances. Well, I subsequently tested that aphorism under all sets of circumstances, in the face of physical pain, in the face of the death of people close to me. And what I found in every case was that it evaporated the fear. Again, demonstrating that a lot of our pain, a lot of our suffering operates within a context of assumption and presumption that we can otherwise counter if we choose. So, yes, now I wanted to make a comment about something. From that point forward, it became of interest to me what power philosophy might have over extreme circumstances, extreme fears. It's often been wondered, I hear this in conversation, why did Christianity triumph as a religion? And one answer that I tend to give, because it worships a man being tortured to death. That Christianity doesn't skirt the fundamental issue, the most extreme issue that human beings can face. It's one thing to have a response to a headache. It's another thing to have a compelling response to torture to death. Okay? Well, once I saw that there was a connection between philosophic rigor and human suffering, that rigor could undercut it, I took a totally different view to my writing of philosophy. From that point forward, I would imagine myself in difficult sets of circumstances. Before I would begin to write philosophy, I would literally say to myself, okay, imagine yourself buried alive. Imagine yourself burned over 95% of your body. Imagine yourself in empty space, in a space capsule, drifting to your death. And in fact, I wrote a short story, lyric poem, kind of a lyric short story called The 10th Hour, based just on that idea, of someone who is adrift, in a space ship, a space capsule with no hope of rescue, and they have 10 hours, to live. I would imagine myself in one of these extreme sets of circumstances, and then I would say to myself, okay, once I was fully in that situation, fully imagining those circumstances, then I would say to myself, okay, now write philosophy. Now write something that can rise to the level of those extremities, those horrific circumstances that we would like to be able to have an answer to, or be able to address in some way that can undercut, allay the pain and the fear and the horror. So space for me became a kind of a venue, for writing philosophy that could address those kinds of extremes, and so could achieve, a high distillation, again, which turned out to be a high distillation of rigor, though I didn't quite know it at the time. And these are issues that we'll be able to explore. I wanted to kind of turn to, at the end here, two topics that are related and often come up in discussions of space travel, what's going on, beyond our Earth in the infinite expanse of galaxies, billions upon billions of stars and billions upon billions of galaxies. Okay, one question is that of life on other worlds, extraterrestrial life, and we're especially interested, I think, in the concept of intelligent life. Life that we might be able to communicate with in some way. It's there's something in physics that I was not aware of when I had similar thoughts, but it's called the Thermi Paradox, and it simply says the strongest argument against extraterrestrial intelligent life is, where is it? What we are reaching out to the cosmos. We are sending, radio messages, to distant galaxies, in the hope that the order of those messages will be recognized as the product of an intelligent process. Why aren't we receiving such? Well, so the absence of such encounters is considered to be strong evidence that maybe there isn't such life. Maybe we are alone. And the strongest consideration for that is, present estimates have the age of the universe at about 15 billion years, give or take. The age of our solar system at about 5 billion years. So relatively young, right? Which means that other galaxies, other worlds had potentially billions of years of head start on us. Our technology has reached the level that it has within a relatively short time. But modern science only goes back about 400 years. Beyond that, but a few thousand years, even our species, a few million years, that's an insignificant amount of time. You would think that given head starts of billions of years and given billions of possibilities for other worlds, other planets, other stars, there would be lots, of intelligent life that might have arisen. The possibility certainly in principle exists. Well, the issue actually is a philosophic one, not an evolutionary one. It's ultimately a question of only what resembles us, and in significant ways will we even be able to recognize as intelligent. When we do animations, when we make trees into sort of sentient communicative beings, we give them things that we might give them things that resemble arms or eyes or features that resemble ourselves. In general, our sense of the intelligent, our sense of intelligence is something that's closely modeled upon us. And animals in general are themselves, again, evolutionarily closely modeled upon us. It's easy to imagine a squirrel, a hamster, a chimpanzee as having significant orders of intelligence. But even there, the difference between us and a hamster is such that it's easy for us to deny, intelligence to it as well, just to see it as a creature that is responding instinctually. Everything is being programmed largely. But it's also easy for us to, intuit, anthropomorphize based on the similarity. Well, one thing we know about evolution, one thing we understand about evolution is that it's a random process. That we didn't, again, according to Darwinian thinking, we didn't come to be because it was an end that was preordained. We came to be through a series of accidental, processes, mutations, environmental change that organisms happened to be adapted to because, again, mutations arose that made them adapted to those circumstances. Evolution does not see life as advancing to a specific end. It just sees it as surviving or not under a set of circumstances. Well, given the randomness of the process, a different planet, a different world will have enough differences and enough random differences over time that it's possible that all sorts of complex chemical systems, let's say, aggregations develop in other worlds. It's possible that none of them, because of the randomness of the process, develop so that they are sufficiently like us for us to recognize them as intelligent. What constitutes intelligent life in some distant world might be what we might see as a cloud or a rock or who knows what, something that we might not even be able to detect, with our senses. So it's not so much a matter of what might be evolutionarily possible. It's more a question of, is the form of life that we might recognize as life, has it developed along sufficiently similar lines that we will be able to recognize it as life or as intelligent life at all? And this goes back to that fundamental existential understanding that we can't leave the world to view it. We're not able to evaluate these things from the outside, from the third person, from the perspective of God, if you like. We have to sort of see things, evaluate things as they're presented to us. We don't discern, see into the essences of things. We decide, summarize things in terms of essences based upon how they present themselves. And again, if they present themselves sufficiently different from ourselves, we're simply not going to be able to apply these concepts of intelligence to them. That's the fundamental issue with recognizing and encountering, intelligent life elsewhere. It may be of such a different form that we don't recognize it and aren't able to categorize it as anything meaningful to us. The other question that sometimes arises in a similar context and has a similar type of response is time travel. And again, just as the main argument against intelligent life, quote unquote, is that we haven't encountered it, yet we think we should have, given the numbers and the possibilities of the numbers of other worlds, enough time having taken place to have achieved our level of biological development. Well, the same thing with time travel. If it's possible, where are they? Where are the people from the future? They should be walking among us if such a thing technologically, can be devised or developed. Now, it's interesting. It turns out that time travel is not a theoretical impossibility because of, again, a philosophical issue, a philosophical understanding. Two of those aphorisms that I mentioned in passing at the beginning. The past can't guarantee the future. The future decides the past. The past is not inviolate. The past is not something that's done with and has a form that cannot be changed. That's a view of the past if we were able to see the past, see the world from outside the world. Our sense of the past and whether it's retaining the form that we know it to have or whether it's undergoing some radical transformation depends upon future experience. I often give the example in response to that basic question, is this world real or dream? Well, if one day we awaken to a totally different experience that persists, then that becomes the reality, and this was dream. And this was especially dream if the divergence, the difference between the future experience and the past is sufficiently radical. And if we don't think that's possible, if we don't think that some future experience doesn't have the power to transform our fundamental sense of any aspect of the past, it's simply because we're not imagining sufficiently radical departures from past experience. So yes, it is theoretically possible for time travel to exist because the past is not fixed, doesn't have a definite form. If one of the main issues with time travel is if we did have such a technology, such a device, how would we know exactly that we were in the past and not in a transformed future? So, but again, the issue isn't a logical one, it's a philosophic one. And it's a matter of ultimately the nature and understanding of our concepts. Okay, I think that might be good for right now. I can take some questions. Do we have any questions? I can't see questions. So, okay, this is the first time I've stopped a little bit early. Oh, hi. Yes, Eric had suggested that I stop a little bit early, to try to allow for some questions. I've been talking, like pretty much till the end, but I thought, since it was suggested that I give some time, maybe. Are there questions?
There are no questions, but we have some comments from our viewers. And actually, it was a wonderful topic and very interesting speech as usual. So thank you so much, Mr. Friedman, for this speech, for this interesting thoughts.
Thank you.
And actually, I do have questions and I do have comments on this. And
Okay.
every time when we listen to your talks, it's like something turning inside the brain, and it's just it requires a lot of effort to understand some specific specific terms and explanations you use. So it is very interesting how the brain works in that moment. And I also I wanted to ask about the how do we know, I know we cannot know it exactly, but how should we think about the past? As you said, we cannot, the past is not the fixed term. So how can we think about it? It's even complicated to...
Yeah, but I will tell you something very interesting that just came to my mind as you're asking that. And so one thing I wanted to say too is that one of the things I'm trying to do, I know that a lot of these ideas might be unfamiliar to people. They might come across as new. And that's why I'm trying to repeat things, and I'm trying to approach things from slightly different directions. But when you asked me that question, what came to my mind immediately was actually something that related to the last question last time about existentialism. The most famous modern existentialist is probably the French philosopher Sartre, right? And Sartre's work became very popular after World War II. That was, in fact, when existentialism became sort of a much discussed, philosophical orientation. Sartre's most famous book was Being and Nothingness. Now, I'm not so much drawn to the work of Sartre, but Sartre said something fascinating about the experience of World War II. Now, during World War II, the French, or at least part of France, was occupied by the Germans. And they were kind of in control of the society. And that marked a point of departure for the French people from their past. And Sartre said that we were most free, and of course, the German occupation is seen as a time of repression, a time when, the streets were filled with German soldiers and one lost traditional liberties and one lived in fear, of the German, control. Well, Sartre, paradoxically, but interestingly, said, we were most free, talking about the French, we were most free during the occupation because we were free of the past. Now, actually, we're always free of the past, rigorously, in the sense that whatever has happened before need not limit us or restrict us moving forward. And that's the point of all the encouragements that people receive. That there's a famous number. I don't know if I've talked about this. I might have mentioned this before. 242. It's like one of the famous numbers, again, for Silicon Valley. 242 is the number of times Harold Schultz, the founder of Starbucks, was rejected by venture capitalists in his effort to get funding for Starbucks. He was rejected 242 times, and you might say, if you fail 242 times, maybe it's time to give up. I mean, if you're not going to give up after 242 times, what's it going to take, right? But he didn't give up. And he had the courage and the determination to walk into the office of venture capitalist 243. And venture capitalist 243 said yes. And that gave us Starbucks. So that's an illustration of acting independently, freely of the past, right? That no matter what our failures have been, the next effort, the next application, the next attempt, and again, I use the example of the battering ram, right? We might, use a battering ram against a door, 5 times it hasn't worked, 6 times it hasn't worked, 10 times it hasn't worked, but maybe the 11th will be the time. And I've referred also to that famous short story by Václav Havel, the first president of the Czech Republic, about that young boy who is constantly banging his head against the wall, a symbol of madness, right? A symbol of insanity. A boy banging his head against the wall, and everyone does think him mad until one day the wall comes down. And of course, that's a metaphor for the fall of the Berlin Wall. So again, we always can be encouraged to act independently of our past failures, because those failures need not restrict us the next time or the time after that, simply rigorously because of any difference that applies between the past and the future. And it's enough of a difference that the background of what you're doing is different each time you do it, right? If you, like when you make your next attempt, you might have made 242 previous attempts. When you make your next attempt, you'll have made 243. That is enough of a difference to mean, again, that rigorously, the past failures do not have to restrict, or make impossible future success. I mean, and we've seen even, like at the end of the 19th century, there were articles written in physics journals, established physics journals, proving that airplanes were impossible, theoretically impossible, that it was theoretically impossible, it violated the laws of physics to ever have an airplane that had a mechanical engine that was heavier than air. And how many efforts had been made before of one failure after another for hundreds of years until the Wright brothers succeeded. So, right? I mean, you have to always keep in mind that rigorously, you cannot justify despair because the next time is automatically different from every previous one.
Yes, and it's, as you said, it's very encouraging and it gives motivation to move forward. So.
Absolutely. Yes,
and
you never justify despair. That is, I mean, philosophy will not stand for it.
That's right. And, but we also learn from our past and past failures, maybe. So we correct them and we move forward and toward our achievements and our goals. So, yeah, that's right. I also have, actually, we do not have enough time. That's pity. I just wanted to quickly ask whether, like, you mentioned that something that we cannot see does not exist. Or did I understand it wrongly?
Oh, something that we are not directly experiencing can take any possible form. Like it may not exist, or we can imagine it in any possible form, but we usually will imagine it to take the form that it was taking when we last saw it. But we don't need to. We can be much more kind of expansive. We can be much more creative, if we like, in our thinking about whatever is not right in front of our eyes. We don't have to be limited, again, by our past experience of something.
Okay, thank you for this clarification. So I think it's time, unfortunately. So we will see each other next Friday. We invite everybody to join us for our next wonderful talks and interesting topics. Thank you, Mr. Friedman, for sharing your thoughts and philosophical ideas on the topic of the nature of philosophy and to exploring where we stand. And I think this topic is never ending, so we can talk about it over and over. And as you said, as you mentioned before, we will have our next sessions intercrossing with these topics we've discussed in the past. So we encourage our viewers to stay tuned and to rewatch or watch our previous sessions if you missed it, so you can be up to date. But now it is all. We wish everybody a wonderful day and wonderful night if it is those who join from the other hemisphere. And see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.